Welcome to Wisdom Trek with Gramps. I am Guthrie Chamberlain, and we are on day 2463 of our trek. The purpose of Wisdom Trek is to create a legacy of wisdom, to seek out discernment and insights, and to boldly grow where few have chosen to grow before. In today's Wisdom Nugget, we'll be diving into the profound and emotional passage of Psalm chapter 22, verses 1 through 10 from the New Living Translation. Psalms 22 is known for its deep anguish and sorrow, as well as the prophetic elements and points of suffering of Jesus on the cross. It is often referred to as the Psalm of the Cross, because of the vivid depiction of the suffering that would later be mirrored by the crucifixion of Christ. As we walk through these first 10 verses, we'll see a range of emotions, despair and loneliness, but also trust and hope in God. Let's begin by reading the entire passage and then breaking it down together. Psalm chapter 22, verses 1 through 10. My God, why have you abandoned me? Why are you so far away when I groan for help? Every day I call to you, my God, but you do not answer. Every night I lift up my voice, but I find no relief. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. Our ancestors trusted in you, and you rescued them. They cried out to you and were saved. They trusted in you and were never disgraced. But I am a worm, I am not a man. I am scorned and despised by all. Everyone who sees me mocks me. They sneer and shake their heads at me, saying, Is this the one who relies on the Lord? Then let the Lord save him. If the Lord loves him so much, let the Lord rescue him. Yet you brought me to safety from my mother's womb, and led me to trust in you at my mother's breast. I was thrust into your arms at my birth, and you have been my God from the moment I was born. We begin with a cry of deep anguish. My God, why have you abandoned me? These words resonate through the ages, famously spoken by Jesus on the cross in Matthew chapter 27, verse 46, and Mark chapter 15, verse 34. In this moment of despair, David, the psalmist, feels utterly forsaken by God. His heart is breaking, and he can't understand why God seems so distant to him in his time of need. Many of us can relate to this feeling of abandonment at various points in our lives. There are moments when we cry out to God, and it seems like our prayers are met with silence. Like David, we may groan for help, wondering why God seems so far when we need him most. Verse 2 continues this plea. Every day I call to you, my God, but you do not answer. Every night I lift my voice, but I find no relief. David's pain is unrelenting day and night, and despite of its fervent prayer, he finds no solace. This paints a vivid picture of what it's like to be in a season of deep suffering, where it feels as though God has turned his back and no answer comes despite our cries. It's important to note that David addresses God as my God. Even in his despair, he hasn't lost connection to God. He's still calling out to him in faith, even though it feels like God isn't listening. This teaches us something powerful about faith. It persists even when we don't feel God's presence. David's relationship with God is still intact, even in his anguish. After expressing his anguish, David shifts his focus in verses 3 through 5 to remind himself of God's holiness and faithfulness. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. Despite feeling abandoned, David acknowledges that God is holy and sovereign. God's character doesn't change based on David's current experience of suffering. This is a crucial lesson for us all. God remains holy, good, and just, even when we are struggling. David then recalls how God has been faithful to his people in the past. Our ancestors trusted in you, and you rescued them. They cried out to you and were saved. They trusted in you and were never disgraced. This remembrance of God's faithfulness serves as a way for David to anchor himself amid his suffering. By looking back on how God delivered his people in the past, David finds a glimmer of hope. We can apply this to our own lives. When we feel abandoned or our life is overwhelming, it can help to remember how God has been faithful in the past, both in our personal lives and throughout history. God's track record of faithfulness can give us confidence that he hasn't forgotten us, even when he feels far away. But David's sorrow doesn't immediately disappear. In verses 6 through 8, he plunges back into describing the depth of his suffering. But I am a worm and not a man. I am scorned and despised by all. David feels utterly dehumanized as he is less than human. This intense feeling of worthlessness is compounded by rejection and mockery to those around him. He goes on to say, Everyone who sees me mocks me. They sneer and shake their heads at me, saying, Is this the one who relies on the Lord? Then let the Lord save him. If the Lord loves him so much, let the Lord rescue him. This mocking echoes what later would be said about Jesus on the cross. where bystanders mocked him, challenging him to save himself if he truly was the Son of God in Matthew chapter 27, verses 39 through 43. David's enemies are not just rejecting him, they're mocking his trust in God. They taunt him, essentially saying, "If your God is so great, why hasn't he saved you?" This can be one of the most painful aspects of suffering. When others mock or question our faith because of our hardships that we're facing, it adds insult to injury when people suggest that our suffering is proof that God doesn't care. Yet even in the face of mockery, David doesn't turn away from God. He doesn't let the taunts of others erode his faith. Instead, he continues to seek God even in his despair. In verses 9 and 10, David once again shifts his focus, this time reflecting on the intimate relationship he had with God since birth. "Yet you brought me safely from my mother's womb, and led me to trust you at my mother's breast. I was thrust into your arms at my birth. You have been my God from the moment I was born." David remembers that God has been with him from the very beginning of his life. God's care and protection were evident even when David was a helpless infant, unable to do anything for himself. This reflection brings David comfort because it reminds him of God's constant presence in his life. Even though he feels abandoned now, the truth is that God has been faithful to him from the start. These verses remind us that God's involvement in our lives doesn't begin when we first acknowledge him or when we start praying. He has been caring for us and watching over us from the moment we were born. Knowing that God's love and care are not dependent on our actions or circumstances is a profound comfort. They have been there since the beginning and will continue to be there even in the moments of our doubt and despair. As we reflect on these first 10 verses of Psalm chapter 22, we can see the tension between despair and trust. David's emotion swings between deep sorrow and firm faith. On the one hand, he feels abandoned by God, surrounded by his enemies, and mocked for his trust in the Lord. On the other hand, he knows that God is holy and faithful. He remembers God's past acts of deliverance and recognizes that God has been with him since birth. This tension is something that many of us experience with our own walk with God. Sometimes we feel that God is distant. Our prayers seem to go unanswered, and we wonder if God has forgotten us. But even in those moments, we can cling to the truth of who God is. Like David, we can acknowledge our pain and despair, but we can also remind ourselves of God's faithfulness, holiness, and intimate care for us. Psalm chapter 22 doesn't shy away from the reality of suffering, but it points us toward hope. And as we'll see in the rest of the psalm, David's lament eventually gives way to praise and confidence in God's ultimate deliverance. As we wrap up for today's trek on Psalm chapter 22, verses 1 through 10, we are left with a powerful picture of what it looks like to wrestle with despair while still holding on to faith. David's raw honesty in this psalm is both heart-wrenching and comforting. It reminds us that it's okay to cry out to God in our pain and express our feelings of abandonment and sorrow. God can handle our deepest emotions. At the same time, the psalmist challenges us to remember God's faithfulness even when we don't feel his presence. He is holy, he is good, and he has been with us since the beginning. I encourage you to take time to meditate on this psalm, especially if you're going through a difficult season. Let David's word inspire you to be honest with God about your struggles, but also hold fast to the hope that he is within you, even in the darkest moments. Thank you for joining me on today's Wisdom Trek. I look forward to continuing this journey with you. Until the next time, keep seeking God's wisdom, keep living with purpose, and let's continue to grow together. And if you found this podcast insightful, please subscribe and leave us a review. Then encourage your friends and family to join us and come along with us tomorrow for another day of Wisdom Trek, creating a legacy. And thank you so much for allowing me to be your guide, your mentor, and most importantly, I am your friend as I serve you through the Wisdom Trek podcast and journal. And as we take this trek of life together, let us always live abundantly, love unconditionally, listen intentionally, learn continuously, lend to others generously, lead with integrity, and leave a living legacy each day. I am Guthrie Chamberlain, reminding you to keep moving forward, enjoy your journey, and create a great day every day. See you next time for more daily wisdom.